Some stories linger in the corners of your mind, and others take up permanent residence, reshaping how you see the world. What I'm about to share with you is one of those stories. A tale rooted in shadowed corridors, whispered warnings, and a feeling of being watched that I will never shake. This is my experience inside the haunted walls of an abandoned manor, a place that seemed alive in its emptiness. It all began during a quiet autumn, the kind of season where the golden leaves and cool winds mask an air of melancholy. My friend, Ryan, had been on a mission to explore local abandoned places, fueled by his newfound obsession with urban exploration. He was persistent, and it wasn't long before I found myself sitting across from him at a diner as he flipped through old newspaper clippings about an estate known as Blackthorn Manor. "You've heard the stories, haven't you?" Ryan asked, leaning forward, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. I hadn't, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The manor had been abandoned for decades, a massive Victorian-style house that sat on the edge of a dense forest just outside town. Once owned by the enigmatic Blackthorn family, the house was rumored to have been the site of strange disappearances and eerie occurrences. Locals believed the family dabbled in something unnatural, though no one could agree on what exactly. "People say it's cursed," Ryan continued, his excitement growing. "They say if you stay there after dark, the house starts responding to you." I was skeptical, but something about the way he described it piqued my curiosity. Despite my better judgment, I agreed to join him on his adventure. The journey to Blackthorn Manor felt like stepping back in time. The road leading to the estate was overgrown and uneven, flanked by towering trees that seemed to grow closer together the further we went. The manor itself came into view suddenly, its silhouette sharp against the dusky sky. It was massive, an imposing structure of weathered brick and cracked windows, with ivy climbing its walls like grasping fingers. The air felt heavy as we approached, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. Ryan, however, was thrilled. He practically bounced up the creaking steps, flashlight in hand. The front door was unlocked, its hinges groaning loudly as it swung open. Inside, the air was cold and stale. Dust blanketed every surface, and cobwebs stretched across corners. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its banisters carved with intricate patterns that had long since faded into obscurity. Every step we took seemed to echo endlessly. "It's incredible," Ryan whispered, snapping photos with his camera. I didn't respond. My focus was drawn to something else, a faint sound, almost like the soft rustle of fabric. I froze, scanning the room, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Shrugging it off, I followed Ryan deeper into the house. As the evening wore on, we explored the manor room by room. Each space seemed to tell its own story: a dining room with a long, dust-covered table, a study lined with shelves of decaying books, a nursery with a single rocking chair that faced the window. The sense of being watched grew stronger with each passing moment. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to paranoia, but there was no denying the unease that gnawed at me. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, we found a mirror, a massive, ornate thing with a cracked surface. It dominated the room, its gilded frame dulled with age. Ryan approached it eagerly, shining his flashlight on its surface. "That's creepy," I muttered, hanging back near the door. "It's amazing," Ryan corrected, running his fingers along the frame. "Imagine the stories this mirror could tell." As he spoke, I thought I saw movement in the corner of the mirror, something shifting behind us. I whipped around, but the hallway was empty. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. "See what?" Ryan replied, distracted by his camera. I didn't press the issue. Instead, I insisted we move on. Eventually, we came across a door that was different from the others. It was smaller, almost hidden at the end of a narrow hallway. The door was locked, but the lock itself was old and rusted. Ryan, ever the adventurer, produced a set of tools from his bag and set to work. "This is probably where they kept their secrets," he joked, but I couldn't muster a smile. When the door finally creaked open, a wave of cold air spilled out, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. The room was pitch black, and our flashlights barely penetrated the darkness. It was a storage room, or at least it had been. Wooden crates and old trunks were stacked haphazardly, their contents long forgotten. And then we heard it, a soft, low moan that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, gripping Ryan's arm. "I don't know," he replied, his bravado faltering. "Let's check it out." Reluctantly, I followed him deeper into the room. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until it was clear we were not alone. At the far end of the room, our flashlights fell on a figure, a tall, shadowy shape that seemed to shift and waver. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Ryan froze, his camera slipping from his hands and crashing to the floor. Is that? He started, but the words caught in his throat. The figure moved, stepping closer with a slow, deliberate motion. I couldn't breathe. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Let's get out of here, I managed to choke out, grabbing Ryan's arm and pulling him toward the door. We didn't stop running until we were outside, the cool night air hitting us like a wave. Ryan was shaking, his face pale. What was that? He whispered. I don't know, I replied, my voice trembling. But I don't think it wanted us there. After our harrowing escape from the Manor's locked room, Ryan and I swore to never speak of what we'd seen, or thought we'd seen, inside Blackthorn Manor. But silence has a way of amplifying unease. In the days that followed, the memory of that shadowy figure began to creep into every corner of my thoughts. Sleep became elusive, and when it came, it was filled with fragmented images of the manor, the mirror, the locked room, and those unseen eyes that had been watching us. Ryan, however, seemed more determined than ever to make sense of what we'd experienced. He called me constantly, his excitement laced with nervous energy. I've been digging, he told me one evening. There's a lot more to Blackthorn Manor than we realized. I didn't want to hear it. The fear I'd felt in that house had been all too real, and I wasn't eager to revisit it. But Ryan's persistence wore me down. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him. Ryan's apartment was cluttered with papers, photos, and old books when I arrived. He'd turned his small living room into a makeshift research hub, and the centerpiece of it all was a faded blueprint of Blackthorn Manor. Okay, he said, gesturing for me to sit. You're going to want to hear this. He began to recount the story of the Blackthorn family, specifically, its patriarch, Edward Blackthorn. Edward had been a wealthy industrialist in the late 1800s, but his success had always been shrouded in mystery. Rumors circulated about his involvement in the occult, and some believed he'd made a pact with something unnatural to achieve his fortune. The family's downfall was just as mysterious, Ryan continued. Edward's wife and 2 children vanished without a trace, and he was found dead in the manor shortly after. Officially, it was ruled a suicide, but what? I asked, leaning forward despite myself. There were signs of a struggle, Ryan said. Furniture overturned, strange markings on the walls. The investigators couldn't explain it, and the case was quietly closed. I shivered, the pieces falling into place in a way that felt too perfect to be a coincidence. There's more, Ryan said, pulling out a photograph. It was an old black and white image of the manor's grand staircase. Standing at the top was a figure, a man in a dark suit, his face obscured. That's Edward Blackthorn, Ryan said. Or at least, that's who it's supposed to be. But this photo was taken years after his death. Despite my initial reluctance, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled onto something significant. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I agreed to return to the manor with Ryan. This time, we came prepared. We brought flashlights, cameras, and even a voice recorder in case we encountered anything out of the ordinary. The plan was simple, gather as much evidence as we could and get out before nightfall. The drive to the manor was quieter this time, the excitement of our first visit replaced with a heavy sense of dread. When the house came into view, its looming silhouette seemed even more menacing than before. Inside, the air felt colder, heavier. The sense of being watched returned almost immediately, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder at every sound. We started in the dining room, where Ryan set up the voice recorder on the long table. Is anyone here? He asked, his voice steady but low. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, the recorder picked up a sound, a soft, whispering voice that we couldn't make out. Ryan's eyes lit up, but I felt my stomach drop. Whatever was here, it wasn't friendly. Our exploration eventually led us back to the room with the cracked mirror. Ryan was determined to investigate it further, despite my protests. The mirror seemed to hum with a strange energy, its surface faintly reflective despite the layers of dust. Ryan approached it cautiously, shining his flashlight on its surface. This thing is ancient, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I think it's tied to the house somehow. I didn't reply. My focus was on the room itself, which felt different from before. The air was colder, and the shadows seemed to shift in ways they shouldn't. And then it happened. Ryan's flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the room into near darkness. I fumbled for my own flashlight, but before I could turn it on, a figure appeared in the mirror. It was Edward Blackthorn. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and lifeless. He raised a hand, pointing directly at us, and then the mirror shattered with a deafening crash. Panic set in as we scrambled out of the room, shards of glass crunching underfoot. Ryan was breathing heavily, his excitement replaced with genuine fear. "We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. But Ryan shook his head. "Not yet. There's something else here. I can feel it." Reluctantly, I followed him down the grand staircase and into the basement, a part of the house we hadn't explored before. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint smell of decay became stronger. At the bottom of the stairs, we found a door, heavy and iron, with strange symbols etched into its surface. "What is this?" I whispered, my breath visible in the freezing air. Ryan didn't answer. He was too focused on the door, his fingers tracing the symbols. "This is it," he said. "This is where it all happened." The door creaked open to reveal a room that could only be described as a shrine, or perhaps an altar. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of unidentifiable substances, and a large, circular symbol was carved into the floor. In the center of the room was a pedestal, upon which rested an old, leather-bound book. Ryan approached it cautiously, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "This is it," he whispered. "This is what Edward Blackthorn was using." I didn't want to know. Every instinct was screaming at me to leave, but Ryan was already flipping through the pages. And then, the room came alive. The symbols on the walls began to glow, and the air filled with a low, guttural chanting. The temperature plummeted, and the shadows in the room began to move, coalescing into a familiar figure. Edward Blackthorn stood before us, his hollow eyes fixed on Ryan. The moment Edward Blackthorn's figure appeared, a cold dread settled over me, a bone-deep terror that told me we were in the presence of something beyond our comprehension. His form was translucent but unmistakable. His hollow, lifeless eyes bore into us as if he could see through every layer of our being. Ryan froze, clutching the old leather-bound book to his chest. The low, guttural chanting filled the room, reverberating in my chest. It wasn't coming from Edward, it was the walls, the air, the house itself. "Put the book down," I hissed at Ryan, my voice barely audible over the cacophony. "We need to get out of here." But Ryan seemed transfixed. His lips moved silently, as though he were trying to read the text in the book despite the chaos around us. The glow of the symbols on the walls grew brighter, casting eerie, shifting shadows that seemed to reach for us. "Ryan," I shouted, finally grabbing his arm and shaking him. "Drop it. Let's go." Edward raised a hand, and the room grew silent. The chanting stopped, and the air became unnaturally still. Then, in a voice that sounded like the groan of rusted metal, Edward spoke. "You should not have come here." Ryan's grip on the book tightened, his knuckles white. "I need to understand," he said, his voice shaking. "Why are you here? What happened to your family?" Edward's face twisted into a grotesque mockery of a smile. "You will know. But knowledge has a price." Without warning, the floor beneath us began to shake. The carved symbol in the center of the room glowed red, and cracks began to form, spreading outward like veins. A dark, acrid smoke seeped from the cracks, filling the air with the stench of burning flesh. Ryan and I stumbled backward, but Edward remained unmoving, his hollow eyes fixed on us. "This place is cursed," Edward said, his voice echoing as though coming from everywhere at once. "Leave, or you will be part of it." I didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing Ryan's arm, I yanked him toward the door. For a moment, he resisted, his eyes darting between the book and the apparition of Edward Blackthorn. "Ryan, please," I shouted. "It's not worth it." Something in my voice must have reached him because he finally let go of the book, letting it fall to the ground with a heavy thud. The moment it hit the floor, the glow from the walls and the floor vanished, and Edward's form flickered like a dying flame. But the house wasn't done with us yet. Ryan's grip on the book tightened, his knuckles white. "I need to understand," he said, his voice shaking. "Why are you here? What happened to your family?" Edward's face twisted into a grotesque mockery of a smile. "You will know. But knowledge has a price." Without warning, the floor beneath us began to shake. The carved symbol in the center of the room glowed red, and cracks began to form, spreading outward like veins. A dark, acrid smoke seeped from the cracks, filling the air with the stench of burning flesh. Ryan and I stumbled backward, but Edward remained unmoving, his hollow eyes fixed on us. This place is cursed, Edward said, his voice echoing as though coming from everywhere at once. Leave, or you will be part of it. I didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing Ryan's arm, I yanked him toward the door. For a moment, he resisted, his eyes darting between the book and the apparition of Edward Blackthorn. Ryan, please, I shouted. It's not worth it. Something in my voice must have reached him because he finally let go of the book, letting it fall to the ground with a heavy thud. The moment it hit the floor, the glow from the walls and the floor vanished, and Edward's form flickered like a dying flame. But the house wasn't done with us yet. As we scrambled back up the staircase, the house came alive. Doors slammed shut on their own, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The walls groaned as though the house itself was angry at our intrusion. Keep moving, I shouted, shoving Ryan ahead of me. My flashlight flickered, casting brief glimpses of the twisted, decaying interior of the manor. We reached the grand staircase, but as we began to descend, the steps beneath us crumbled. I grabbed the banister just in time to stop myself from falling into the gaping void that had opened beneath us. We're trapped, Ryan shouted, his voice tinged with panic. I looked around, my mind racing. There had to be another way out. My eyes landed on a window at the far end of the hallway. Without thinking, I grabbed Ryan's hand and pulled him toward it. Help me, I shouted, motioning for him to help me break the glass. Together, we used a piece of broken furniture to shatter the window. The cold night air rushed in, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat inside the house. We climbed through the window, landing hard on the overgrown grass outside. Behind us, the manor seemed to breathe, its windows glowing faintly as though watching us leave. For a moment, we just lay there, gasping for air. Then, with a low groan, the house seemed to sigh, and the glow from its windows faded. The oppressive energy that had surrounded it dissipated, leaving behind an eerie silence. We didn't speak much on the drive back to town. Ryan stared out the window, his face pale and drawn. I could tell he was replaying everything that had happened, just as I was. When we finally reached my apartment, we sat in silence for a long time before Ryan finally spoke. I can't stop thinking about it, he said. That book. Edward. What if there's more to the story? I shook my head. No. We're done, Ryan. Whatever's in that house needs to stay there. But I could see the conflict in his eyes. For Ryan, the experience had been more than just a brush with the supernatural. It had been a puzzle, a mystery that he was desperate to solve. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Edward's face, heard his voice. The events of the night played over and over in my mind, a loop I couldn't escape. Over the next few weeks, Ryan and I drifted apart. He became increasingly consumed by his research, spending hours at the library and poring over old records. I tried to move on, but the memories of the manor lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. Then, one night, I got a call from Ryan. His voice was frantic, his words tumbling over each other. I found something, he said. You need to see this. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him. When I arrived, he was sitting at his desk, surrounded by papers and photographs. In his hand was a worn, yellowed letter. This was written by Edward Blackthorn, he said, handing it to me. It's a confession. The letter detailed Edward's descent into madness after the disappearance of his family. He spoke of the book, the rituals, and the entity he had summoned in a desperate attempt to bring them back. But instead of reuniting with his loved ones, he had unleashed something dark and uncontrollable. He was trying to contain it, Ryan said. That's why he stayed in the house. He was trying to keep it from spreading. The weight of Edward's sacrifice hit me like a punch to the gut. He hadn't been a monster, he'd been a man consumed by grief, willing to do anything to undo his loss. Ryan and I agreed on one thing: the house needed to be sealed off, its secrets buried forever. We contacted the local authorities, claiming the house was structurally unsafe and needed to be demolished. They were reluctant at first, but eventually, they agreed. Watching the manor crumble under the weight of the demolition equipment was both a relief and a heartbreak. It felt like the end of an era, the closing of a chapter that had haunted the town for generations. But even as the house was reduced to rubble, I couldn't shake the feeling that its darkness hadn't been fully contained. The memory of Edward's hollow eyes and the sinister presence in the basement lingered, a reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Years later, I still think about Blackthorn Manor. I wonder if we did the right thing, if destroying the house truly ended the curse, or if we simply unleashed it on the world. Ryan moved away shortly after the manor was demolished. We lost touch, but every now and then, I hear rumors about strange occurrences in the area where the manor once stood. As for me, I've tried to put the experience behind me, but there are nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, certain that I hear Edward's voice whispering in the darkness. Knowledge has a price, and I fear we've only begun to pay it. Thank you for joining me on this terrifying journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling tales of the paranormal.